It takes about 6 minutes to walk from St. George's Church of Ireland Church at George's Place near Hardwick Street, to walk from there to this church of St. Francis Xavier. 6 minutes. On the 15th of July, 1861, yes, Blessed John Sullivan was baptized in that church. 99 years later, his mortal remains were transferred from Trongoswood College Cemetery to this church, and they're with us to this very day. I'm sure we all know the outline details of his life and upbringing and so on. Born to a father and mother, the father Lord Chancellor, member of the Church of Ireland, his mother Lady Elizabeth, devout Catholic with a great love for the poor. And that love for the poor was something that became very much part of Blessed John's life. Private education within his family, and at the age of 12, he went to school to Portora Royal School in Enniskillen, in Fermanagh. Father Matthias Bodkin, who wrote a lovely life of Blessed John, describes how Portora was then under the headmastership of Dr. William Steele, the outstanding Protestant headmaster of his time. He was in the flower of his reputation, upright, generous, deeply religious. His character and his teachings formed character and piety in the pupils. And Dr. Steele, who had an influence on John's faith, he would prepare the Greek text for the Sunday service with the boys, and they all went off to the parish church Sunday after Sunday. In the beautifully bound volumes that came back from Rome describing all the process of Blessed John's beatification, it says here about his time in Portora, he was distinguished in studies and won many prizes for scripture and classics. Throughout his life he had great love for this school, which had a great reputation for its high cultural standards and religious atmosphere. And Father Bodkin emphasized that his schooling there was of central importance in his life. And even 20 years after John's death, the headmaster, Reverend Graham, spoke of the great pride the school had in Blessed John. When he was still in school there at the age of 17, his older brother Robert was tragically drowned at the age of 24. A terrible shock to him, but particularly to his mother. I'll refer to this in a few moments. But her faith at the time touched John very, very profoundly. At around the age of 19-20, he headed off to Trinity College to study law, to study classics, where again he had a distinguished career. At the age of 24, his father died unexpectedly. Shortly after that, he headed off to London for legal studies, was called to the bar, distinguished man. He was left comfortably off through his father's legacy and wore the finest of clothes, and a Jesuit priest described him as being the best dressed young man in Dublin of his time. And he was also much sought after, unsuccessfully, as a very eligible bachelor. He was a strong man, loved to cycle long distances. During the years between then and his reception into the Catholic Church, he travelled a lot, walked a lot, spent some time with the Greek Orthodox monks in Mount Athos, and bit by bit he felt drawn into the Catholic Church. But more about that later. He became a Jesuit novice at the age of 39, probably twice as old as all the other novices. His novice master there was a very man with great reputation for holiness, a Father Michael Brown. And then he was ordained a priest at the age of 46. But I think more important than the actual details of the dates and the ages and where and what, we can ask ourselves, what's he remembered for? I think we wouldn't be here unless we had some special particular memory of him. He was sent to Stonyhurst College in Lancashire to study philosophy as part of his Jesuit formation. The superior there said, "The Irish Jesuits have sent us a great blessing. To have a man of God living among us is proof of God's special favour." A man of God. That's everything. He spent long hours in prayer when he was in Trongoswood College as a teacher and spiritual father, despite all the other duties he had. He was known for his devotion to the Blessed Sacrament and to Our Lady. His devotion to the sick and the suffering was described as heroic. No task, no distance was too much for him to carry out and to visit. He had some extraordinary gifts of the Spirit. He knew things before they happened. He was a man of great mortification. His clothing was famous for being very scanty and patched and worn. And his shoes, he was often offered better shoes, but he wouldn't accept them. His diet was mainly porridge and rice and bread and weak tea. Very great sacrifices hard on himself. He was known for his fast walk, somewhere between a shuffle and a trot, always going somewhere. When he was looking after the students in Rathfarnham Castle in Dublin, he travelled around on the buses and he would say his rosary, the rosary beads hidden in his hat, but praying away. Little things like that. He had a great reputation due to the healings and graces following his prayers. He prayed a long time over people, not just a few Hail Marys, but a long time of prayer. There were healings of the mind, of the body, and of the soul. Through his prayers and intercession and even contacts, jobs were got, houses were found, people returned to the life of faith, even in foreign countries. A letter back from San Francisco, "My brother has stopped going to church. Will you offer Mass for him?" Very shortly afterwards, confession and Holy Communion. A local woman in the district of Clongo said, "He seemed to be able to take on all our troubles and sufferings." And a woman once said to him, "Father John, I want you to pray for something. Will you put your whole heart into it?" She wouldn't have needed to ask. Their troubles became his troubles. Their worries became his. There was a man working in Clongo's Wood College, a Mr. Cribben. He had to work late at night to fix something in the church, the boys' chapel, and he heard Father John up in front of the altar groaning in his prayer. He was really pleading with the Lord for some special favour. He took them to heart. He was physically very strong. No distance was too far for him. I understand that he cycled up to a hospital here in Dublin when a little boy, a nephew of Michael Collins, the great leader, was paralysed in one leg. And Father John came and prayed over him for a long time. And then the nurse took him off to give him a bath. And in the bath his leg straightened out, completely healed. And I understand that he spoke on the Late Late Show about that some years ago. One of the boys in the school said, "I considered him to be a saint." This was the general opinion among the boys. Dozens, hundreds, thousands of recollections of people. And at one point, Father John said, because a young man, a student of the school, who was thinking about becoming a priest, he asked Blessed John's advice. And this is what he said, and I'm certain he was speaking from his own experience. "If only you knew how much sin, sorrow, and suffering there is in the world, and how much a priest can do to comfort, console, and raise the fallen, you would not hesitate." And the pupil did become a priest. During his life, great favours, and immediately after his painful death, suffered through with great patience and kindness and charity. People around Clongo's County Kildare began to visit his grave, take away pieces of clay, leave rosary beads and medals, and so on. He was known to appear to people after death. I found a letter a few days ago, well, I found it some months ago, but I read it out on Galway local radio yesterday, a woman from East Galway. She had no knowledge of Father John except very, very faint knowledge. He appeared to her, told her, "Say a decade of the rosary every day for me, I will cure your pains." Shortly afterwards, the doctors took her off all medication she'd been on for 5 years. There was a murder inquiry in County Kildare in 1976, and Blessed John appeared in the Garda station there. It was written up by retired Detective Garda Jerry O'Carroll, and he was just astonished. He saw this figure standing there for about 25 minutes. The detective went out for something, came back in, and he asked the officer who was there, "Who was that man there standing?" Oh, he said there was nobody there. And then he found a picture of Blessed John, and he said, "That's who it was. That's who it was." And he had reason to visit a man in Tullamore, Mr. Pocock, as one of his employees was included among the people of interest in the crime. And Mr. Pocock then, he told Mr. Pocock about Blessed John appearing at the Garda station. And then Mr. Pocock told him the following story. He said some years before he'd been diagnosed with terminal cancer. The doctors held no hope. He was preparing himself for death, and on his deathbed he heard a voice calling his name. He looked up and saw a man standing at the foot of his bed who said, "I am Father John Sullivan. Do not worry." He went to sleep, woke the next morning, rang the bell for breakfast and got out of bed. The nurses, the doctors, the consultants all crowded round in amazement and shock. X-rays revealed no cancer. Within 3 days, he was back home with his family. Just one of many healings attributed to Blessed John. How did this come about? Was it through the prayers of a little girl of 4 whose name was Annie? And the Sisters of Mercy and the Sisters of Charity put her up to learning a little prayer. God bless Mr. Sullivan and make him a holy Jesuit. 3 or 4 years of age. He'd say, "Say it again, Annie, say it again." And she was one of the witnesses called in the process, and she said, "I think he liked the prayer because he asked me to repeat it." And when she was engaged to be married, the sister said, "Go out to Rathfarnham Castle, get Blessed John to bless her engagement ring." And he did. And he told her, God looks after everything. Maybe it was her prayers. Maybe it was the intervention of a domestic staff woman in Trinity College who chided all the students there for not going to church on Sunday. And he said to her, "Church going means nothing to me now," despite all the faith he was given in Portora, etc. Was it because he overheard a catechism class through an open window in a hotel in County Kerry in Glencar? He sat and listened, standing in his bare feet outside the window. Then he sat, asked could he come in and listen to the class the next day, and so on. Maybe it was the poor Clare sisters in Ballyjamestuff who prayed for him. One nun said, "He's such a holy-looking man you could light a candle in front of him." Maybe it was his sister Annie, who had such a great love for the poor as their mother had. Maybe it was the prayers of the monks of Mount Athos. Maybe they saw something in him. Maybe it was his love for the poor and the dying. Maybe they touched his heart very deeply. And for all of us who turn to Blessed John in our times of trouble, we'll never know until the next life the good impact our struggles have on other people. Everything counts, my brothers and sisters. Everything we go counts for something in the bigger picture of life. All of these people in small and big ways played a huge part in Blessed John's life. But it was the work of God, through one person in particular. But first of all, just to quote Paul to the Ephesians, chapter 3, verse 7, "I became a servant of this gospel by the gift of God's grace, given to me through the working of his power." It was God's work, working through people as well. He heard the call to the rich young man, "Sell all you have and give it to the poor. Take up your cross daily and follow me. Seek first the kingdom of God." But to my own mother's prayers, tears, and agony of soul, I owe the salvation of my own soul. I know how much a woman's prayers can do, mother or sister. I can say with all my heart, I believe it's impossible for a child of those tears ever to be lost. Now to refer back to his brother's death when John was only 17. He wrote a letter to the mother of a boy from Clongoweswood College who died. "I can form some idea of your anguish from what I saw of my own dear mother when her best-loved son, the woman whom she almost idolized, was taken from her at the age of 24 without a moment's warning. She never saw his face again, never even had the satisfaction of weeping at his grave, where his remains were never found. I cannot tell you what agony she endured during those days after his loss, hoping against hope that his remains might be recovered. I believe that only for her passionate love for our Lord and for her boundless faith, she would have lost her reason. To her prayers at that time and to her resignation to God's will, I owe everything. God alone knows what that means." His cross, his crucifix. It was his mother's cross all her life, When John took religious vows as a Jesuit novice, that became his crucifix, his vow crucifix. But his mother's cross made that crucifix a very special one. It was bathed in her tears, her faithful and persistent tears, the anguish and the grief. She would have held that cross, I'm sure, close to her heart. He held that cross in his own hands when he preached, and on his deathbed it's inscribed. He said one time, he wrote, "The only book you can read on your deathbed is the cross." His mother could never have anticipated the enormous fruit her sufferings would bear. It bore great fruit. Without the tragedy of Robert's death, would we be here today? Probably not. Even in his dying, his tragic dying, there was a hidden blessing for all of us, for all of us. Blessed John said one time and wrote, "God is a father and always must do the most merciful thing. We shall know this later on, but it is hard to see it now. God never sends a terrible cross like this without soon sending a great blessing." The cross. Take up your cross. It doesn't go to waste. We can think of the suffering servant in the prophet Isaiah, man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. He took our infirmities upon us and carried our sorrows. By his wounds we were healed. Coming towards the end now, to quote Dr. Sheila Cassidy, she wrote a book called Good Friday People. She was arrested in Chile in 1973 because she treated people during a time of a government takeover by the military. She treated people from both sides. She was imprisoned. And she went through that suffering and she wrote the following: "I believe that Good Friday people are very specially loved by God. He has called them to walk towards him along a particularly narrow path, the road to Calvary. I believe most deeply they do not walk this path by chance. They do not walk it in vain. I have no clever answer to the eternal question of why, but I'm convinced that whatever its cause, whatever its outcome, it is never without meaning. And this: some are clearly purified and strengthened by the cross and go on to do great things for God and his people. Others are quite simply broken, dehumanized and destroyed. I'm afraid that's true too. Some people don't survive it. But here's the lovely thing. When we love somebody who's a Good Friday person, who's innocently suffering, their cross becomes our cross. Their hurt becomes our hurt. Their tears become our tears. We then become Good Friday people. And when Jesus was suffering in the agony in the garden, an angel came to comfort him. We're invited to do that too. We're invited to be an angel of mercy, and also we're invited to share in the cross of the Lord himself. St. Ignatius wrote this, and I read this at the vigil of the removal of my dear friend David Toohey. David, also a dear friend of Archbishop Michael. And by the way, I knew about Portora long before I knew about Blessed John Sullivan. I was in the rowing crew of St. Ignatius in Galway, and our strongest opponents were from Portora. And in the 1960s, 4 future Jesuits competed against the boys of Portora, including David and Father Joe Keeney, who's with the Lord, and Father Martin Curry, who's in Galway. I don't know what became of the boys in the Portora crew, but I'm sure they made good as well. But anyway, this is what St. Ignatius said, and I read this at David Toohey's vigil. St. Ignatius said, "If God causes you to suffer much, it's a sign that he has great designs for you. He intends to make you a saint. If you wish to become a great saint, ask him to give you much opportunity for suffering. There is no wood better to kindle the fire of holy love than the wood of the cross, which Christ used for his own great sacrifice of boundless love. Nothing goes to waste. There is no wood better to kindle the fire of holy love than the wood of the cross, which Christ used for his own great sacrifice of boundless love." May Blessed John be with us on our journey.